Late one day, Theodore and Foduck were floating home together. "Guess who I saw?" It was Benjamin Bridge. "Who did you see?" asked Theodore. "Someone smaller than me and made from a tree," said Benjamin mysteriously. Benjamin always loves telling riddles about all the things he can see from way up there. "Smaller than Benjamin," said Theodore. "That's just about everyone." Said Foduck. "Made from a tree. That means made of wood. Was it a dock?" "No," said Benjamin. "I saw a canoe." "A canoe?" repeated Theodore. "You know," said Foduck. "A canoe is a small boat made from tree bark, like Kulu." "Right!" boomed Benjamin. "Kulu! That's who I saw!" "Kulu?" Theodore shouted. "Kulu's come to visit?" "Oh, no," Foduck mumbled to himself. "Not again." Back at the Great Ocean Dock, the dispatcher had a special announcement. "Tugboats," he began, "I have decided that tonight, because Kulu is visiting, you may go and listen to some of his stories." "Hooray!" shouted Hank. "Great!" roared George. "Terrific!" tooted Theodore and Emily. "Phooey!" groaned Foduck. "Theodore," whispered Hank, "why doesn't Foduck like Kulu's stories?" "I think Foduck likes stories about real things," said Theodore quietly. Now, Foduck really didn't want to go listen to Kulu's stories, but the other tugs asked him to shine the way with a special light. Hidden Cove is far from the bright lights of the harbor. Even with Foduck's light, it was still quite dark. The tugs looked this way and that way, but they didn't see Kulu. "Look," Theodore said softly. Kulu the Canoe was suddenly there, touched by the first faint fingers of the silvery moon. "He always just kind of appears," breathed Emily. "I wonder where he does come from," said Hank in a hushed voice. "Come closer," Kulu was calling to the tugs. The tugs could see the canoe clearly now. He was made all of bark from a birch tree and had a beautiful rounded shape. "We were wondering," said Theodore. "That is, we all hoped you could tell us a story?" "Yes, a story," said Hank, moving closer. "A really good story," said George. "But not too long," grumbled Foduck. Foduck aimed his special light in the middle of the circle of tugboats. And that made it kind of like a campfire. And Kulu began his story. "This is a story about the Northern Lights," said Kulu. "Ooh," said Hank, "the Northern Lights." "Long, long ago," continued Kulu, "there was a great canoe built from the bark of a single tree. Her name was Kikuk." "Ah," said Hank, "Kikuk is a nice name." "Shh," whispered the other tugs. "Kikuk loved to sail far, far from where the other canoes lived," Kulu went on. "Sometimes she would sail so far from home, she would get lost." "How did she ever find her way home?" asked Emily. "She had a special paddle," replied Kulu, "and it always pointed the way home." "Like your paddle," said Theodore. "Yes," said Kulu. "My paddle always points my way home." One day, there was a big storm, and Kikuk lost her paddle. "Well, how'd she find her way home?" asked George. "The old canoes," explained Kulu, "who live in the sky, floated back and forth and back and forth. And their ripples made magic ripples of light in the sky. Just like the ripples we make when we move through the water," said Hank. Kikuk followed the bright ripples of light, continued Kulu, and they led her all the way home. They call those ripples of light the Northern Lights. And on very special nights, you can still see them dancing in the sky above. What a great story, said Theodore. Can you tell us another one? Of course, said Kulu. Just then there was a deep rumble of thunder. We'll have to have our story tomorrow, said Emily. It sounds like a storm is coming. The tugs floated home to their dock, still talking about Kulu's story. I hope I get to see the Northern Lights one day, said Theodore. Well, I've never seen them, huffed Fodak. I don't believe any of Kulu's make-believe stories. Well, it stormed all night, a terrible storm, and the next day, too. Of course, work in the big harbor never stops, storm or no storm. Theodore and Fodak were docking a ship. Don't forget, we're going to visit Kulu when we're finished, called Theodore. He promised to tell us another story. Oh, you go ahead, answered Fodak. I don't want to hear those silly old stories. But you know the way to Hidden Cove, said Theodore. Now, Fodak liked being the one who knew things. Well, he said at last, I suppose so. Well, by the time Theodore and Fodak reached Hidden Cove, the storm was almost over. The sky was beginning to clear. The tugs looked around, but Kulu was nowhere to be found. He's not here, said Fodak. Well, that's funny, frowned Theodore. He promised to tell us a story. Fodak was already turning to go when Theodore saw a sight that almost stopped his engine. That's Kulu's paddle, he gasped. Well, maybe he forgot it, said Fodak. Oh, he'd never leave without his paddle, said Theodore. It points his way home. Well, this time Fodak didn't say anything. You see, he really didn't believe that Kulu's paddle was magic. Theodore put Kulu's paddle up on his deck, and the two tugs set off into the gathering dark to search for him. They looked everywhere, but there was no Kulu to be seen. There is one place we haven't looked, said Theodore quietly. Shipwreck Rock. Well, what makes you think Kulu's at Shipwreck Rock? Said Fodak. He's there, said Theodore. I just know. Well, by the time those tired tugs had almost reached Shipwreck Rock, it was night. Fodak turned on his light, but then it just went out. Oh, I must have worn it out when I was shining it during Kulu's stories, groaned Fodak. We'll never find Kulu now, said Theodore sadly. It's getting late, said Fodak. We really better go home, Theodore. Theodore? Theodore? Theodore was staring at something. Something, well, it seemed almost magical. What is it? Fodak said. Lights, said Theodore. Thousands and thousands of lights. They looked like ripples in the sky. said Fodak slowly. Didn't Kulu say, whispered Theodore, that you can see ripples of light when the old canoes float back and forth in the sky? The Northern Lights, gasped Theodore. Those must be the Northern Lights. I didn't believe there were such things, gasped Fodak. They're so beautiful. Look, cried Theodore. There! Fodak turned, and there, in the glow of the Northern Lights, was Kulu. The storm had tossed him right up on the sand near Shipwreck Rock. Theodore pulled Kulu gently down from the sand with his tow rope. How did you ever find me? Said Kulu. Oh, smiled Theodore, we had some help. From some old friends of yours, added Fodak. They all looked up at the Northern Lights. Yes, said Kulu. They are good friends. Kulu, said Fodak, do you know any more stories?